The second division of the skeletal system is known as the appendicular skeleton. It's known as the appendicular skeleton because it forms the appendages, the upper limb and lower limb. It also contains what's known as the girdles. The girdles are what allows your limbs to attach to the body. For example, your upper limb attaches via the pectoral or shoulder girdle, and your lower limb attaches via the pelvic or hip girdle. So as you can see, there are many bones of the appendicular skeleton, 126 total, added to the 80 bones of the axial skeleton to get to the 206 bones of the entire typical adult skeleton. So let's begin with the clavicle and scapula, which together form your pectoral girdle. The clavicle is often called your collarbone, and it is fairly easy in that it has two ends. One end articulates with the sternum. That end of the clavicle is known as the sternal end. The joint is known as the sternoclavicular joint. The more lateral end of the clavicle is known as the acromial end, and we'll learn that acromial refers to this part of the scapula known as the acromion. So this joint here is between the clavicle and the scapula. It's known as the acromioclavicular joint, often called the AC joint. When we get to the scapula, we'll note that it forms a ball and socket joint with your humerus, your upper arm bone. So we're going to look at much closer at both these bones. Beginning with the clavicle, we have a couple different views, a superior view and then an inferior view. But again, what we're really trying to do is just be able to identify the two ends. The sternal end, forming the sternoclavicular joint, and the acromial end, forming the acromioclavicular joint. So those are the two ends of your collarbone or clavicle. The scapula has a lot more on it to be aware of. It has two major processes or projections. One is known as the spine, but then it ends as the acromion. So this high point here is known as the acromion. That is actually what acromion means. It means high point in your shoulder. You'll notice there's a small little facet. That's where your clavicle would articulate. Notice the next process is more curved. In fact, it's named after its resemblance to a crow's beak. The coracoid process. Coracoid means crow's beak. Then we have the glenoid cavity or glenoid fossa. That's going to form the socket for the ball and socket joint known as your shoulder joint, or more specifically, the glenohumeral joint. Those are three really important parts to the scapula. The rest of it is this kind of blade look, right? And that's why it's known as the shoulder blade. The anterior surface has a shallow depression known as the subscapular fossa. This medial edge of the scapula is known as the vertebral border or medial border. This would be facing the arm, so it's the lateral or axillary border. And then you have the inferior angle down at the bottom. Here's the posterior view, which we note that the acromion is that high point again. If we move down from it, this region is known as the spine of the scapula. So the spine of the scapula comes up posteriorly and ends as the acromion. Above that spine, there's a depression or a shallow depression known as the supraspinous fossa because it's above the spine. Below the spine is a region called the infraspinous fossa. These are all very important in that there are muscles located in these areas that help stabilize your shoulder joint. You may have heard of the rotator cuff muscles. We're going to learn those 4 rotator cuff muscles, and they're named very similar to these fossa. Spine, supraspinous, infraspinous fossa, and you can see a much better view here of the glenoid cavity. Okay, now let's move into the humerus. We will cover the humerus in the next video, and hopefully maybe even move down into the radius and ulna in the next video.